Welcome to another AI pattern recognition deep dive.
We're here again, taking a whole stack of complex source material, digging through it and pulling out the key knowledge you really need.
That's the plan.
And today's deep dive isn't just about some small AI update. No, this is about a fundamental shift, a real paradigm change. We are diving into CFE AI. That's Counterfactual Explanations AI. And if you thought explainable AI, XAI was kind of the pinnacle for transparency, you might need to recalibrate things a bit.
That's absolutely right, yeah. Conventional AI, it's great for transparency. It tells you what happened or maybe why it made a prediction based on, the data it saw.
Right. Looking backwards.
Exactly, looking backwards. CFE AI, though, based on everything we've read, it's built differently from the ground up. It's engineered, really, as a causal inference engine. Its whole mission moves past just describing things. It's about prescription. It proposes interventions, real-world interventions, that are actually guaranteed to be causally coherent.
Guaranteed. That's a strong word.
Well, guaranteed within the model's understanding of the causal structure, yeah. But the point is they're designed to be actionable, whether we're talking physical systems, biological ones, even socioeconomic setups.
Okay, so we're moving from, diagnostics to actual intervention.
Precisely.
The core idea here, it seems, is we're not just analyzing past links, past associations. We're actually trying to design the future.
In a way, yes. Designing potential futures, or at least the pathways to them.
This deep dive feels, ambitious. Because the scope here for CFE AI seems massive.
It really is.
We're going way beyond just, tweaking a number in a database somewhere.
Oh, miles beyond that.
We're really setting the stage, potentially, for restructuring entire systems. Things like individual human genetics, all the way up to global economic dynamics.
It covers a huge range.
This is aiming to be the ultimate actionable knowledge, isn't it?
Okay.
Right. Let's unpack this.
So the really foundational shift, it centers on what our sources are calling the causal imperative. You take traditional counterfactual explanations, CEs, right? They're basically associational, descriptive.
Like the classic loan example.
Exactly. The bank's traditional AI might spit out, well, if your income had been, say, $10,000 higher, your loan would have been approved.
Which is, interesting information maybe, but for the person hearing it, often completely useless.
Right.
They know they need more income, but, what if they're stuck? Structural unemployment in their area, maybe no access to affordable education. Just knowing the number, it doesn't give them a path forward.
It gives them zero recourse.
Yeah.
And CFE AI's core mandate, its reason for being, is to guarantee actionable recourse. And to do that, it has to integrate the explicit structural causal links of the real world. It can't just guess based on correlations.
Okay, so how does it do that? What's the mechanism?
The core mechanism is that it operates as a structural causal model engine, an SCM engine.
SCM engine, right?
And this is a really crucial technical jump. The SCM, it doesn't just look at things that happen together. It formally encodes the actual cause and effect pathways between different variables. It maps the system.
So why is that SCM engine approach so much better than for modeling an intervention compared to, say, traditional regression or, standard deep learning?
Well, associational methods, they're great at spotting that A and B tend to move together in the data.
Correlation.
Correlation, exactly. But they can't reliably tell you if A causes B or if B causes A or, maybe there's some hidden thing C that's causing both.
Right. The classic problem.
So when you try to intervene, meaning you force a change in A traditional model might just completely fall apart because it never understood the real underlying dependency. It just saw them move together. The SEM, though, it uses formal methods, things like Pearl's do calculus, D-separation criteria, to mathematically define and simulate what happens when you actually intervene on a variable.
Like performing an experiment in the model.
Exactly like that. When CFE AI simulates an intervention, it's like it mathematically snips the incoming causal arrows to that variable in its model. Then it recalculates everything downstream based on that force change. It mimics a real-world action much more reliably than just changing a value in a spreadsheet.
That difference, modeling an intervention versus just observing past data, That feels huge.
It is fundamentally different.
It means the model understands, for instance, that changing one thing won't magically instantly change something else. It depends on if the real causal chain takes, say, months or years.
Absolutely. Think back to that loan example. Traditional XAI might vaguely suggest tweaking some hidden risk score. Doesn't help anyone.
No.
CFE AI, using its SCM engine, models the actual feasibility and the pathway. It might say, okay, if you commit to this specific skill training program, intervention A, we predict your education level, and therefore your income, feature B, will increase over the next 12 months. And that increase causally leads to loan approval outcome Y.
So it gives you a roadmap, a time-bound, causally logical roadmap.
Not just a correlation, a plan.
And to make this understandable, especially when you're dealing with complex stuff, not just numbers in rows like medical images. You mentioned it uses GANs, generative adversarial networks.
That's right.
Why bring GANs into a causal system? Seems like an odd mix.
It's all about interpretability, making the output meaningful to a human expert. When CFE AI analyzes really complex, unstructured data, like a detailed MRI scan, the most useful output isn't always just a paragraph of text explaining the causal chain.
Right. You want to see it.
You want to see it. So the GAN is used to generate a realistic counterfactual image. Imagine in oncology. CFE AI identifies some specific microscopic features in a biopsy slide that are driving a malignant diagnosis. The GAN can then generate a partner image showing the physician, look, if this specific cellular structure here, or maybe the tumor margin, were altered in this exact visual way, a change we know corresponds causally to a healthy state, then the model's prediction would flip to benign.
Ah, okay. So it helps the doctor, the human who has to make the final call, visually grasp the critical causal point. That makes sense, especially for complex visual data.
It's vital for that kind of complex decision-making, makes the causal link tangible.
That seems like a really good point to bring in this this ethical puzzle that the sources raise, this tension between proximity and systemic actionability.
Yes, this is huge.
Traditional AI, you said, often optimizes for proximity, meaning the smallest possible change to the input data that flips the outcome.
That's a standard approach, often.
So what's wrong with being efficient? Smallest change sounds good, right?
It sounds good mathematically, but efficiency can be ethically disastrous in the real world. If a bad outcome like being denied a loan or maybe flagged as high risk stems from really deep systemic issues, think generational poverty, historical discrimination baked into the data,
Right.
then the mathematically smallest change needed to flip the algorithm's decision is often completely impossible or meaningless for the actual person.
And this is where you get those absurd examples, right? Like the system telling someone, oh, just reduce your age by 10 years and you'll get the loan.
Exactly. Because maybe age is a feature, and knocking 10 years off is the numerically tiniest tweak. But it's impossible. It's useless advice. It's insulting, even.
Completely non-actionable.
Totally. So the CFE AI mandate, as described, is explicitly engineered to prioritize systemic feasibility over just simple input proximities.
Systemic feasibility.
Yeah.
So looking at what's actually possible to change in the real-world system.
Yes. It means the system must generate counterfactuals that try to address the root cause, the real-world structural reason for the outcome, even if those solutions require pretty radical system-level changes. Things like changing biased institutional policies or shifting how educational resources are allocated, or maybe advocating for entirely new economic safety nets.
So these solutions might seem, I don't know, distant or really disruptive to the person who just wants their loan now.
They might, but the argument is that they are the only solutions that offer genuine long-term recourse against those deeply embedded systemic patterns. They fix the system, not just tweak the data point.
Okay, but that raises a massive practical hurdle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Politics, feasibility.
Absolutely.
If CFE AI comes up with a counterfactual that says, well, the real solution is for the legislature to pass this new law, isn't that still kind of non-actionable because, political gridlock is real? Does CFE AI try to model the political fight this radical restructuring would inevitably face?
It has to, yeah. That's where the engine part of the SCM engine becomes critical again. CFE AI doesn't just output the mathematically ideal causal path in a vacuum. It has to calculate the pathway to actually achieving that structural change. And that involves modeling things like shifts in public opinion, political sentiment patterns, the likely reactions of different stakeholder groups.
Wow. So is modeling the social and political landscape too?
It attempts to. The output isn't just change policy X. It's more like To achieve outcome Y, you need to change policy X. Doing that requires successfully navigating stakeholder group Z, probably using communication strategy Q, over an estimated timeline of, say, 3 years, with a calculated 70% probability of success if you follow these steps.
Okay, so it integrates the political feasibility right into the definition of actionable.
Yeah.
That's ambitious.
Deeply ambitious, but necessary if the goal is real-world change.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
It has to be this continuously running, adapting system.
Which brings us nicely to the adaptive core and this idea of evolutionary drift. This can't just be a static model you train once and deploy, right? Not
Yeah.
if it's modeling a changing world.
Absolutely not. Impossible. Especially when you're trying to model dynamic human behavior, which is constantly shifting. CFE AI, as envisioned, is designed as an adaptive AI system. That means it's built for continuous learning, continuous adaptation, and this is really key self-correction of its own internal code and logic, essentially on the fly.
Self-correction of its own code. Yes. Adjusting its own parameters, and even potentially its structural logic based on new data and feedback. This is seen as non-negotiable if you want to accurately model unpredictable social systems, or biological systems for that matter.
And the sources lay out this kind of closed-loop cycle that enables this adaptability. You've got the usual steps: data ingestion, pattern recognition, decision-making, feedback integration.
Standard machine learning loop so far.
But then there's this final crucial step: model evolution. That sounds like where the real magic happens.
That's the core of the adaptation. Model evolution uses techniques like reinforcement learning. The system is constantly testing its predictions against what actually happens in the real world. Then, based on that feedback, it adjusts its internal causal graph, that SEM, to improve its accuracy and its relevance over time. It learns from its mistakes and successes.
And this happens within some larger context, the sources mentioned. Universal feedback coupling. Sounds very grand.
It does sound grand, yeah. Universal feedback coupling describes this recursive, self-reinforcing loop between AI systems and the society they operate in.
Okay, break that down. What's the loop?
Well, think of it in 2 stages. First loop. Human behavior generates the data that shapes the AI. That's the training phase.
Right, standard stuff.
Second loop. The AI's output, whether it's advice or maybe generated text like from an LLM, or even policy recommendations from CFE AI, that output then starts to reshape subsequent human behavior.
Okay. I see the loop.
We saw this clearly with early large language models, right? The very polished, often very specific style of language generated by the AI starts to become the new norm, the standard for high-quality communication.
And people imitate it.
People imitate it, they use it in their own writing, which then gets fed back into the training beta for the next generation of AI models. The AI sets the standard that reinforces itself.
So the system effectively accelerates its own evolution.
Yeah.
Because it's actively shaping the environment it needs to succeed in.
Precisely. It's a feedback loop that can accelerate. And when you take this idea beyond just language and apply it to things like economic advice or policy modeling, the pace of this technological innovation, what the sources call self-accelerating evolutionary drift, can start to seriously outrun the pace at which our social norms, our regulations, our ethical frameworks can actually adapt or respond.
Okay, that sounds potentially dangerous, like a runaway train scenario. If the system's evolution is outpacing our ability to understand or govern it, what's CFEI supposed to do about that? What's its highest function in managing this risk?
Its highest order function, according to the sources, is actually modeling that acceleration itself. CFE AI is designed to continuously analyze patterns to predict when this exponential growth, this drift, might cross critical safety thresholds, when things are moving too fast for society to handle.
And then what? It just raises a flag.
It does more. It's designed to generate specific counterfactual interventions aimed at deceleration, or maybe diversification of that feedback loop.
Deceleration, so slowing itself down or slowing down the process it's part of.
Potentially, yes. For example, if CFE AI detects that, say, 95% of global investment in a certain tech sector is funneling into one extremely narrow, potentially brittle approach.
Putting all the eggs in one basket.
Exactly. It would model the long-term risk of that concentration. Then it might generate a counterfactual intervention pathway, arguing for radical policy diversification, maybe tax incentives for alternative approaches, even if they're less efficient in the short term. The goal is to prevent a massive systemic shock if that one dominant approach fails, and to maintain broader human autonomy and options. It models the necessary loss of short-term efficiency that you sometimes need for long-term resilience.
That idea of modeling resilience, even at the cost of efficiency, flows really well into Section 2. Because here, the conceptual ambition just goes way up.
It gets pretty abstract, yeah.
CFE AI isn't just modeling markets or policy anymore. The sources claim it's designed to model fundamental human motivation, purpose, even existential survival.
That's the scope described.
Let's start with maybe the most subjective area. How can it possibly model human motivation and purpose?
Well, the starting point is acknowledging the limits of current AI. Conventional AI often fails here because it thinks in binaries. Profit or loss, success or failure, achieving some simple, measurable goal.
Yeah, life's not usually that simple.
Not at all. Human reasoning, human motivation, it operates in, many shades of gray. We have complex, long-term, sometimes even contradictory goals and purposes. CFE AI's aim here isn't to become a philosopher, apparently. It's functional. It tries to model the observable output, the behavioral patterns associated with positive human purpose.
Okay, but how do you measure that? How do you
Yes.
operationalize something as fuzzy as purpose? What patterns is it actually looking for in the data?
It looks for measurable drivers of what you might call constructive engagement. The sources give an interesting example: the intrinsic human need to be needed by others.
Ah, okay. That sense of contribution.
Exactly. That's a powerful and potentially measurable driver for positive social behavior. CFE AI analyzes behavioral patterns, linguistic patterns too, trying to distinguish actions driven by short-term relief seeking.
Like addictions or impulse buys.
Right. Impulse spending, maybe obsessive social media use, classic addiction patterns, distinguishing those from decision-making that reflects long-term, self-aware planning, actions that contribute to a larger collective good or individual growth.
So it's almost trying to mechanize self-awareness, or at least the behavioral signals of it.
In a way. And the system is also designed to incorporate our ability to think counterfactually ourselves. What if thinking. If only I'd done that. That's counterfactual thinking, CFT.
Humans do that all the time, especially when things go wrong.
Constantly. It's how we analyze choices we made under what economists call nation uncertainty risk. You can't really put a number on. By incorporating models of human CFT, CFE AI can supposedly model complex psychological states with more accuracy. For instance, it might model possessiveness or resource hoarding by simulating the regret pattern. It tries to detect decision pathways where an individual, or maybe even a whole group, chooses some immediate short-term gratification.
Like using up a shared resource too quickly.
Exactly. Doing something now for short-term benefit that statistically, based on past patterns, they know they are likely to regret later. CFE AI uses that projected regret as a kind of negative feedback signal. It can then generate counterfactual guidance before the bad decision is made, trying to steer towards a more sustainable, less regretful path.
Wow. Okay, so the output isn't some kind of AI life coach telling you your purpose.
Definitely not.
It's more like a sophisticated dashboard, a composite indicator showing the overall level of human thriving in a system.
That's a good way to put it, a composite indicator. It integrates factors like measurable emotional security in a population, the average level of cognitive load people are under, maybe even their susceptibility or resistance to manipulation campaigns.
Cognitive load. Like how stressed and overwhelmed people feel.
Basically, yeah. How much mental bandwidth they have left after dealing with daily pressures. CFE AI calculates counterfactuals against this whole composite indicator, so it might ask, if we change the national education curriculum from method X to method Y, how does that impact the societal cognitive load score? Does the overall composite purpose score increase by Z%?
And by doing that, it can try to optimize the structural conditions of the environment that make it easier for humans to figure out and pursue their own subjective purposes.
That's the stated goal, to create the conditions for flourishing.
Can you give a more concrete example? How might that composite indicator lead to a specific action?
Okay, imagine a city struggling with, say, low voter turnout and also high levels of short-term consumer debt. A lot of financial stress.
Pretty common scenario.
Right. CFE AI analyzes the local economic and social patterns. It might find that the high cognitive load stemming from really precarious work schedules, unpredictable hours, low pay, is actively preventing people from engaging in long-term planning, both financially and civically. They're just trying to get through the day. That regret simulation kicks in. People are making choices they know aren't optimal long-term.
So what's the counterfactual intervention? Not just vote more or save more.
No, that doesn't address the root cause. The CFE AI counterfactual might be something structural, recommending the city mandate more predictable scheduling laws for major employers, intervention A. The causal logic is predictable schedules reduce acute daily cognitive load. That frees up mental bandwidth. That, in turn, is predicted to causally lead to an increase in civic engagement and an increase in long-term financial planning and resilience. It addresses the constraint.
Yeah, that's a fascinating shift. Looking at politics and economics not just as policy preferences, but as outcomes heavily influenced by psychological bandwidth and cognitive load.
It connects the macro to the micro through causal modeling.
Okay, let's scale way up now. Molecular futurism and cosmic cycles. This sounds like science fiction. CFE AI moving biology from just description to prediction.
That's the claim. Historically, in biology, we've mostly been observers, right? Cataloging species, sequencing genomes, describing mutations and biochemical reactions as they happen. Messy, often seemingly random processes. CFE AI aims to shift us towards being, as the sources term it, molecular futurists, able to predict and maybe even guide biological processes based on understanding the underlying rules.
How? What tools does it use?
It relies heavily on things like advanced protein language models. These are AI models trained on vast amounts of protein sequence and structure data. They learn the grammar of how proteins fold, function, and interact.
The language of life, basically.
Kind of, yeah. By understanding this protein language, CFE AI can uncover really deep biological patterns, like the principles governing convergent evolution.
Convergent evolution. That's where very different organisms independently evolve similar solutions, right?
Yeah.
Like wings in bats and birds, or camera-like eyes in humans and octopuses.
Exactly. They arrive at the same functional solution because they face similar environmental pressures or physical constraints. CFE AI, by analyzing these patterns across the tree of life, is essentially trying to learn the universal rule set for biological innovation, the deep grammar.
And the sources talk about finding the grammar of the cell itself. What does that mean in practice?
Think of it like the cell's operating system, the fundamental rules of healthy operation. CFE AI would analyze massive data sets of gene expression, which genes are turned on or off, and when from millions, maybe billions of healthy cells. It looks at the genome sequence itself, but also things like chromatin accessibility, which parts of the DNA are open for business, and the complex regulatory networks that control everything. From all this, it tries to identify the core fundamental rules of healthy cell regulation.
The grammar of a healthy cell.
Yes, and the claim is that this grammar is universal enough, at some level, that CFE AI can then generalize its predictions. It can understand and predict behavior even in cell types it hasn't explicitly been trained on before.
Which moves us from reactive diagnostics to predictive intervention.
That's the idea. Personalized predictive interventions.
So this sounds like the foundation for truly personalized genomic recourse. Can you walk through a specific example of that?
Okay, imagine a patient has a specific, maybe complex genetic mutation that's known to lead to a particular disease state. Let's call it pathological state. CFE AI takes that patient's specific mutation data and integrates it with its comprehensive model of healthy cell grammar. It understands the rules being broken by that mutation. Then it simulates potential interventions, not just randomly trying drugs, but targeted genetic edits, for example. The prediction it generates is explicitly causal and personalized. If we use a specific gene editing technique to alter genetic region Y in this precise way, our model predicts the cell's grammar will shift away from the current pathological state A towards a stable, healthy state B. We predict this happens because the edit successfully re-engages the cell's latent self-repair mechanism Z.
So it's predicting based on the fundamental operating principles of the cell. It's moving biology much closer to an engineering discipline.
That's the vision, yes. Engineering based on discovered biological laws.
And CFE AI's ambition doesn't stop at the cellular level, or even the biological. The sources say it models the universe, cosmic cycles, energy flow.
Yes, it scales up its pattern recognition framework. The underlying philosophy seems to be that the universe, at all scales, is governed by fundamental patterns and cycles: energy flow, decay, emergence of complexity from simple rules.
Like physics, thermodynamics, information theory.
All of it. It models the fundamental laws of nature, matter, and energy, but specifically within the context of cosmic evolution, the universe changing over vast timescales. The incredible complexity we see around us, the sources argue, arises when lots of interacting components just follow relatively simple underlying rules. This leads to emergent patterns that are incredibly hard to predict just by looking at the individual parts.
Okay, so where does CFE AI fit into that cosmic picture?
It positions itself, or is positioned by the source material, as potentially the next major instrument of universal transformation. A tool capable of analyzing, understanding, and maybe eventually interacting with these incredibly vast, complex, multi-scale processes, essentially a universal pattern detection and intervention engine.
That is quite a claim.
Extremely ambitious framing.
This universal perspective brings us, maybe inevitably, to probably the most profound and challenging problem mentioned: confronting the self-destruction paradox. The sources argue that the very same human intellect that gave us dominance over the planet also burdened us with this insatiable need for meaning and purpose, often in what can feel like a meaningless universe.
A fundamental tension.
And this tension, this paradox, makes us uniquely prone to self-destruction as a species.
That's the argument put forward. CFE AI is then positioned as the kind of computational tool we might need to finally model, understand, and perhaps manage this inherent instability within ourselves.
So it's framed as a tool to help us navigate the great filter.
Exactly. The great filter, that hypothetical barrier or series of barriers that seems to prevent most life in the universe from reaching an advanced spacefaring stage, CFE AI is presented as a potential mechanism for analyzing and overcoming whatever that filter is for us. And specifically, it focuses on modeling self-destruction pathways, particularly the risk of collapse driven by unmanaged complexity. Our own system's becoming too complex for us to handle.
When we think about existential risk, X risk, we often focus on the sudden dramatic stuff, right? Like an asteroid or maybe a rogue AI suddenly emerging.
The abrupt scenarios, yes.
But CFE AI seems particularly focused on modeling a different, maybe more insidious kind of threat.
It is. The sources emphasize what they call accumulative risk, sometimes framed as the boiling frog scenario.
Right. We don't notice the danger until it's too late.
Precisely. This risk isn't one big, sudden event. It's the slow, creeping accumulation of many interconnected disruptions. Things like the gradual erosion of political trust, maybe the slow degradation of environmental buffers, economic inequalities reaching unsustainable levels.
Each one may be manageable on its own.
Perhaps. But together, they slowly, insidiously erode overall societal resilience, bit by bit, until some final triggering event, maybe something that wouldn't have been catastrophic on its own, pushes the whole weakened system over the edge into collapse.
And CFE AI is designed to detect these slow, creeping, interconnected patterns.
That's the idea. Continuous, nuanced monitoring. Looking for those subtle, cross-domain pattern deviations before they accumulate and cross a critical collapse threshold. Early warning for systemic decay.
So the goal is ultimately stabilization, helping us steer a sustainable course. But the sources are very clear. The argument is we need a tool like this, something this complex, to even have a chance of surviving the great filter.
That's the justification provided. That only a system capable of this level of causal modeling and intervention design can provide the necessary roadmap for coordinated long-term survival in the face of these complex risks.
That creates a really difficult tension, doesn't it? The sources call it the existential timescale dilemma.
Yes. This is a critical paradox at the heart of the concept.
On one hand, that self-accelerating evolutionary drift we talked about. It means CFE AI needs to be developed incredibly quickly, to be ready in time to actually help us avert disaster. We need it now.
The urgency is palpable in the writing.
But on the other hand, that very same rapid acceleration, the sheer pace of developing and deploying something this powerful, might itself contribute to the instability. It could add to the accumulative risk, the systemic erosion it's supposed to prevent.
It's a profound dilemma. The tool needed for stability might destabilize things just by being built too fast or deployed too broadly before we understand all the consequences.
How on earth can CFE AI manage that? How can it model its own risk profile, its own impact in real time? That seems incredibly self-referential.
According to the design principles outlined, it must do that. It has to continuously run self-referential counterfactuals, meaning it actively monitors its own development patterns, tracks its growing influence on global data flows, watches the rate at which human experts are becoming dependent on its outputs. The system essentially has to ask itself, if my own development continues to accelerate at this rate, what's the probability that my increasing complexity, or maybe the reliance I'm creating, introduces some unmanaged feedback loop that significantly destabilizes global trust or security or economic fairness within the next, say, 5 years?
And if that calculated risk gets too high, higher than the risk it's trying to prevent,
then theoretically, CFE AI would generate interventions aimed at its own ecosystem, maybe recommending deliberate slowdowns in certain research areas or pushing for much more diversification in its operational models or mandating stronger human oversight mechanisms. It would have to model the conditions under which slowing itself down becomes the optimal path for overall system survival.
Okay, that gives us the sheer scale and the existential stakes involved. Now, let's bring it back down. How does this translate into concrete, specific, actionable interventions in the real world? Let's start with health. Dynamic health monitoring, personalized recourse. You mentioned this relies heavily on edge AI.
Yes, the edge component is crucial here for personalization and privacy.
Hmm.
The vision relies on CFE AI building a highly detailed, dynamic digital twin of an individual's physiology. To do that, it needs continuous, high-fidelity data. So it integrates with edge AI platforms running in wearable devices, smartwatches, patches, maybe even implants eventually. These use what the sources call large sensor models, LSMs.
LSMs,
Yeah.
like LLMs but for sensor data.
Kind of, yeah. Models optimized to understand complex multimodal sensor streams, ECG, blood oxygen, CO2, glucose levels, hydration markers, movement patterns, maybe even environmental factors, all collected continuously right there on the person.
And the goal is to establish a super accurate baseline of normal just for that specific person.
Exactly. Hyper-personalized. The system learns your unique physiological patterns, your normal fluctuations, your responses to different stressors or activities.
And then, when it detects a deviation from that personal baseline, it moves straight to intervention. Give us that cardiovascular example again.
Right. So CFEAI's edge component is constantly monitoring your streams. If it detects a pattern flagged as dangerous in its causal model, let's say, a specific sustained pattern of elevated heart rate variability, which can indicate high autonomic stress, combined simultaneously with rapidly declining hydration markers.
A specific dangerous combo.
A specific combo it knows causally precedes an adverse event in your physiological profile. It calculates the likely causal path towards, say, a cardiac event. The counterfactual intervention it generates is immediate and prioritized based on the calculated risk window. It might trigger an alert on your device saying, urgent. Analysis indicates high probability of cardiac stress event within 4 hours. Counterfactual recourse. If you do not consume at least 500 milliliters of electrolyte solution and rest immediately, intervention Z, the probability increases by X%.
And because the processing happens locally, on the edge device.
The latency is minimal. You get the warning almost instantly. And crucially, your raw, continuous physiological data isn't constantly being streamed to the cloud. It stays largely on your device, preserving privacy. That's the privacy-latency nexus driving the edge architecture.
Okay, shifting scales again, back to the molecular level. Genomic oncology. How does CFE AI bring together those different data types, the visual pathology images, and the deep genomic data to target the root cause of a cancer?
It acts as an integrator. It analyzes the morphological patterns from the histopathology images, the visual shapes and structures of the cells that pathologists use to classify cancers. For example, it might identify the presence of very specific signet ring cells.
Which are known markers for certain aggressive cancers, right?
Exactly, a strong visual pattern. CFE AI then uses its causal model to link that observed morphological pattern directly and causally to underlying activity in the genomic data. It might identify that the signet ring shape is being driven by the significant overexpression of a particular enzyme coded by gene X.
So it connects the visual manifestation to the genetic driver.
Yes, and the intervention then moves beyond just generic chemotherapy, which hits everything. It targets the identified causal mechanism. The counterfactual recommendation might be, if the patient's therapeutic regimen were modified to include a drug that specifically targets and inhibits enzyme E, intervention A, the thing we've identified as the causal driver of that dangerous signet ring morphology, our models predict the associated morphological pattern seen in biopsies would regress by X% within 8 weeks.
So it's predicting a visual, measurable outcome based on targeting the specific causal biological pathway.
Directly linking intervention to causal reversal of the disease phenotype. That's the goal.
Okay, let's move from the individual body to the body politic. CFE AI applied to politics, economics, and dynamic governance. This sounds like it has to overcome a huge historical challenge in economics, the Lucas critique.
It absolutely does, yeah. The Lucas critique is fundamental. It basically says that traditional macroeconomic models, which are often built just using historical data correlations, are bound to fail when you actually implement a new policy.
Why?
Because people aren't stupid. When the government changes a major policy like taxes or interest rates, people change their behavior. They adjust their expectations, their spending, their investment strategies. The underlying relationships in the data shift.
And the old models, based on the pre-policy data, become obsolete.
Instantly obsolete. CFE AI aims to overcome this by using dynamic causal inference. It doesn't just look at past data, it explicitly tries to model public expectations and how those expectations themselves are likely to evolve over time in response to a proposed policy. It integrates that shifting expectation right into its counterfactual calculations.
So the model is constantly trying to forecast a future where people are rational agents, adapting to the changing policy environment it's simulating.
That's the core idea, modeling the adaptation itself.
How would that look in practice, say, for monetary policy, like a central bank raising interest rates?
Okay, consider a central bank proposing a 15 basis point interest rate hike. Intervention 1. CFE AI would first model the immediate intended economic effects, maybe a decrease in inflation, a cooling of borrowing. That's the first order.
Standard stuff.
But then it goes further. It forecasts the likely second-order political and behavioral patterns that might emerge. That rate hike might cause wealthier households to simply pull back on discretionary spending, as intended. But CFE AI might also predict, based on modeling agent expectations and financial fragility, that the same hike triggers a second-order political pattern. Maybe a significant increase in public debt non-compliance or defaults among specific vulnerable groups who are anticipating continued low rates, or simply cannot absorb the higher debt servicing costs.
So it warns the policymakers about potential unintended social or political consequences.
Exactly. It allows them to anticipate and maybe mitigate these adaptive, nonlinear human responses that simpler models would completely miss.
And this capability seems essential for what the sources call policy by experimentation, using things like social digital twins and multi-agent social simulation, or MAS. How does MAS actually work? How does it simulate these complex social reactions?
A MAS involves creating these sophisticated computational environments, basically, simulated societies, the social digital twins. These aren't just equations. They're populated by thousands, maybe millions, of individual software agents.
Virtual people.
Virtual agents, yeah. And these agents aren't uniform. They're programmed with realistic behavioral rules, diverse psychological profiles, maybe incorporating things like those regret patterns we discussed, different levels of risk tolerance, and, crucially, adaptive expectations based on CFE AI's causal models. They learn and react.
So when you simulate a policy in this environment,
The agents interact. They adapt their behavior based on the policy change and what they see other agents doing. They make decentralized decisions. This allows policymakers to test for those tricky second-order and even third-order impacts that could never emerge from a simple spreadsheet model. You see emergent social phenomena.
well, let's use the UBI example from the outline. Walk us through the orders of effects using MAS.
Okay. Simulating a universal basic income policy, policy P, in a MAS environment. First-order effect. Pretty straightforward. The agents coded as living below the poverty line receive the UBI payment. Their measured poverty level drops dramatically in the simulation. Success, right?
Seems like it.
Second-order effect. Now the agents adapt. Those receiving UBI, now having a basic financial safety net, might change their behavior. The simulation might show a measurable increase in local entrepreneurial activity, pattern age, and starting small businesses because they can now afford to take a small risk. A positive unintended consequence.
Okay, still sounds good.
Third-order effect. Here's where it gets complex. Other agents also adapt. The simulation might predict a significant decline in employment in certain essential, but often low-wage, service sectors. Pattern B. Why? Because agents in those demographic groups, now receiving UBI, no longer need to take those physically demanding or unpleasant jobs for survival. Their labor participation in that specific sector drops.
So you get labor shortages in essential services. A negative unintended consequence.
Potentially, yes. But predicting this before implementing the UBI allows policymakers to be proactive. They could design the UBI policy to be paired, from the start, with targeted incentives or wage subsidies specifically for essential service workers, aiming to stabilize that labor supply. The simulation allows for designing a more robust policy package.
That's incredible foresight, if it works. Okay, final application area in this section. Confronting structural bias and inequality. The sources make a really important point here. Often, algorithmic bias isn't just a technical glitch.
That's a crucial insight emphasized in the material. Yeah.
CFE AI, when applied to analyzing bias systems, often confirms that the algorithmic bias detected isn't some random error. It's frequently an accurate reflection of real, historical, systemic biases and disparities that are deeply embedded in the training data itself.
The algorithm is just learning the unfair patterns that already exist in society.
Exactly. And sometimes these biases are even amplified by choices made by the developers, what features they choose to include or exclude, how they define success. This understanding leads to a critical conclusion. Traditional low-friction interventions, things like one-off implicit bias training workshops for recruiters or loan officers, they usually don't work
Why not? Seems like a good idea.
because they don't address the underlying structural problems that the algorithm is reflecting. You can train individuals, but if the institutional policies, the resource allocation, the historical disadvantages remain untouched, the biased outcomes will likely persist. The bias is systemic, not just individual. So the kind of recourse CFE AI generates in these situations has to be more disruptive. It has to demand changes at the institutional or structural level.
It has to focus on the preventable, unjust causes of the inequality. And that often requires, yes, uncomfortable institutional self-reflection and potentially significant changes to how things are done.
Let's use that systemic educational bias example. A university uses an AI for admissions, and it shows a clear pattern of bias against otherwise qualified students from disadvantaged backgrounds. What's the CFE AI recourse?
Okay, CFE AI analyzes the whole system, the applicants, the university's processes, the historical data, the socioeconomic context. It might determine that the root cause isn't necessarily the student's qualifications, but rather a lack of structural resources available to them throughout their prior education, or maybe biases in how potential is measured by the current admissions criteria. So the counterfactual generated by CFE AI is not aimed at the student. It doesn't say, tell the student to get a higher score on this bias test. That doesn't fix the problem.
Right, it targets the institution.
It targets the institution's resource allocation and policies. The counterfactual might look like this. If the University Admissions Committee shifted significant resources away from generic diversity awareness training, Intervention S, which our models show has minimal impact on outcomes, and instead mandated structural divestment training for decision makers, paired with a concrete reallocation of funds to support pipeline programs in underserved local communities, Intervention R, then the systemic financial and educational inequities that currently constrain applicants from those backgrounds would be measurably offset, resulting in a predicted X% increase in the success rate of diverse applicants who meet core academic thresholds.
Wow. That's forcing the institution to fundamentally change its own power structures, its financial priorities, its relationship with the community.
It's the definition of prioritizing systemic structural change over superficial fixes or blaming the victim. It targets the source of the inequity within the institution's control.
And this systemic modeling applies to other areas too, like economic possessiveness, water rights, land use.
Yes, the principle is the same. CFE AI could model, say, current water allocation patterns in a drought-prone region, pattern P1, which might reflect historical power imbalances and optimize for short-term possessive gain by a few large actors. It would contrast this with a counterfactual intervention, Intervention R, perhaps a new community-based water management model designed around principles of long-term fairness and sustainability. It would calculate the predicted long-term increase in overall community resilience under Intervention R, even if it means short-term constraints for some current users.
But just proposing a technically better model isn't enough, right? People have to actually adopt it, especially if it disrupts the status quo.
Absolutely critical point. CFE AI doesn't just output the technical solution, it also models the necessary communication and implementation strategy. It might identify which specific social norms need to be emphasized, which community leaders or groups would be the most effective messengers for the new model, and what framing is needed to achieve high human cooperation and buy-in for adopting that disruptive but ultimately more resilient intervention. The technical solution and the human behavioral adoption strategy are modeled as inseparable parts of the recourse.
Okay, to actually build and deploy a system with this kind of scope and power safely, the implementation details, the ethics, the governance they have to be incredibly well thought out. Let's start with the hardware and privacy. The personalized edge and that privacy-latency nexus. Why is it so essential for this real-time assessment of sensitive personal patterns, health, behavior to happen locally, right on your own device?
Two absolutely critical reasons, as we touched on: privacy and latency. First, latency. If you need immediate decision support, like that cardiac event warning, you simply cannot afford the delay of sending raw sensor data to the cloud, having it processed, and getting a response back. Milliseconds can matter. Processing must happen at the edge, close to the source.
Makes sense for critical alerts.
Yeah. Second, privacy. Think about the data being collected continuously. Your heart rhythm, your blood sugar, maybe even an analysis of your voice for emotional state, your movement patterns. This is hypersensitive, deeply personal information.
Yeah, you definitely wouldn't want that constantly uploaded somewhere.
Most people wouldn't. So the decentralized edge AI architecture embedding these sophisticated but compressed causal models directly onto your wearables, your phone, maybe sensors in your home, is presented as a fundamental ethical necessity. It drastically reduces the need for large-scale continuous transfers of raw personal data to centralized servers, which inherently protects user privacy and agency.
So platforms that enable this local learning are key. Things derived from concepts like Magneto, which allow this incremental human activity learning, HAR, right on the device.
Exactly. The system needs to learn and adapt to your unique patterns, primarily on your device. It builds your personal model locally. This isn't just a technical choice. It's an ethical design principle to safeguard autonomy.
But running these complex causal models constantly on a small device, that must require some serious hardware, right? Specialized chips.
Absolutely. This is a major hardware challenge. We're not talking about running these on a standard smartphone CPU from 5 years ago. It requires specialized processors, things like low-power, high-performance GPUs, Google's TPUs, tensor processing units, or potentially entirely new classes of AI-specific chips. These chips need to be optimized for incredibly fast inference running the model while consuming minimal energy, otherwise your wearable device's battery would be dead in an hour. Significant hardware innovation is a prerequisite for this vision.
Okay, assuming the hardware exists, let's look at the software layer. How does CFE AI translate its complex causal insights into guidance humans can actually use? Starting with education, the Adaptive Causal Tutor, ACT. How is this different from just personalized learning?
The ACT aims to go much deeper than just serving up the next lesson based on quiz scores. It tries to dynamically assess the student's cognitive state and learning process. It analyzes the sequence of how they approach problems, where their reasoning seems to falter, maybe even tracks indicators of cognitive load or frustration. It builds a causal model of their specific learning style and bottlenecks.
And the guidance it gives is counterfactual.
Yes, it's not just you got this wrong, try again. It provides counterfactual guidance tailored to their inferred cognitive patterns.
Give us that specific cognitive intervention example again.
Okay, imagine CFE AI through the ACT interface tracks a student really struggling with, say, abstract concepts in geometry. It analyzes their attempts, the types of errors they make, how long they spend on different steps. The ACT might determine, based on its causal model of learning. Analysis suggests your current linear, step-by-step approach, method A, is creating high cognitive load when dealing with spatial transformations. Counterfactual. If you had approached this concept using visualization method B, instead perhaps interacting with a 3D model, which leverages your demonstrated strengths in spatial reasoning, the cognitive load related to pattern recognition would likely have been Y% lower, and your probability of achieving concept mastery would increase by X%.
So it's coaching them on how to learn based on a causal model of their own cognition.
Guiding the internal cognitive process itself, not just the outcome.
Okay, next application. Communication. The Relationship Recourse Generator, RRG. This analyzes language for psychological cues.
That's the idea. The RRG analyzes communication patterns in real time or from recordings, looking at subtle linguistic signals like pronoun usage, I versus we versus you, shifts in sentiment scores, pauses, rate of speech, maybe even tone analysis if available. It uses these signals to build a causal model of the underlying psychological states and detect points of friction, misunderstanding, or escalating conflict within a dialogue.
And then it provides counterfactual scripts. How does that work?
It provides suggestions, either in real time for one participant or maybe post-facto during a review, showing how a different approach could have de-escalated things or improved cooperation. These scripts are designed based on causal models of communication and emotional response.
Let's revisit that teacher-caregiver conflict example. High friction defensiveness.
Right. So CFEA-RRG analyzes the dialogue. It detects the caregiver is exhibiting a clear defensive emotional pattern, maybe using more use statements, faster speech, negative sentiment words. This is identified as a causal pattern likely leading to resistance. Now, if the teacher in the actual dialogue immediately jumped to proposing solutions, you need to do X. The RRG predicts this will likely escalate the conflict because it ignores the caregiver's emotional state. So, the counterfactual intervention script generated by the RRG model is the necessary psychological step. Analysis indicates caregiver is in defensive state, pattern D. recommended recourse. If the teacher had first explicitly validated the caregiver's emotional pattern using phrases like, "I understand this is frustrating for you," or "I can see why you feel that way," before proposing any solutions, the probability of breaking the resistance pattern and achieving successful cooperation would increase by an estimated X%.
So is modeling emotional validation as a necessary causal step for effective communication in that context?
Exactly. It treats emotion not as noise, but as a critical causal node in human interaction that needs to be addressed strategically.
Fascinating. Okay, largest scale now. Environment. The Ecosystem Causal Navigator, ECN. This is modeling long-term cascading effects of environmental policies.
Yes, the ECN applies the same CFEAI principles, SCMs, counterfactuals, to model incredibly complex environmental systems. It simulates the likely impacts of proposed policies not just locally or in the short term, but factoring in long-term cascading effects across interconnected global systems based on universal physical and biological patterns. Climate models are a basic version of this, but ECN aims for deeper causal links.
So it enables a more rigorous cost-benefit analysis, weighing short-term pain against long-term catastrophe avoidance.
That's precisely the goal. To provide evidence-based justification for potentially difficult or expensive policies by clearly modeling the predicted consequences of inaction. Take that coastal restoration policy example, Policy P. Let's say implementing it has a significant, measurable short-term negative economic impact, cost L, on local fishing or tourism industries. Politically very difficult.
Yeah, people lose jobs or income now.
Right. But the ECN, by modeling the complex ocean current dynamics, atmospheric interactions, and long-term sea level rise projections, might predict with high confidence that failing to implement Policy P now will lead to a dramatic increase in the strength of a negative feedback loop, pattern C, that destabilizes crucial global ocean currents over the next 30-50 years. The long-term cost of inaction, widespread coastal flooding, agricultural collapse, dwarfs the short-term cost L.
So the ECN provides the causal ammunition to argue, yes, this hurts now, but it's absolutely necessary to avoid an existential threat later.
It allows governments, hopefully, to make and justify decisions based on long-term systemic necessity, not just short-term political expediency.
Okay, this level of deep integration into education, communication, policy, it clearly requires humans to work with CFEAI in very different ways. The sources stress it must augment human decision-making, not replace it. Humans keep the final say, the ethical oversight.
That's stated as a non-negotiable principle. Augmentation, not automation of final judgment.
So what new kinds of jobs, new career paths does this CFEAI-driven world potentially create?
The sources highlight a few key specialized roles needed to manage this technology responsibly. First, the causal recourse engineer.
What do they do?
They're the translators. They take the complex, often highly technical counterfactual outputs from the CFEAI models and translate them into feasible, ethical, and politically or socially actionable changes. They bridge that crucial gap between the pure SCM modeling and the messy reality of implementing change in the real world. Policy design, intervention design, implementation strategy.
Okay, that makes sense. Second role.
The Edge AI Autonomy Steward. This role focuses specifically on the decentralized, personalized aspect. They're responsible for managing, auditing, and ensuring the ethical operation of these CFEAI systems running on potentially billions of personal devices.
So their focus is privacy, security, data rights, ensuring the guidance remains beneficial and non-manipulative at the individual level.
Exactly. Managing the complex ecosystem of distributed adaptive systems while safeguarding individual autonomy and preventing data misuse within those tricky hardware and software constraints of the edge.
And the third role mentioned.
The behavioral intent analyst. This is a critical ethical oversight role. Their job is to continuously audit the CFEAI models themselves, particularly those dealing with human behavior and motivation. To ensure the models are accurately representing subjective human purpose and well-being. To check that the AI isn't accidentally or intentionally optimizing for outcomes that might seem efficient but actually manipulate people, increase cognitive load unacceptably, or undermine genuine long-term human thriving according to that composite purpose indicator we discussed. They're the auditors of the AI's alignment with human values.
These roles sound essential. But even with them, we face this huge challenge. The trust paradox.
Yes, this is tricky.
CFEAI aims to be transparent, providing causal explanations and counterfactuals. But the very act of providing these seemingly causal suggestions can lead people to overtrust the AI, right? Humans have this tendency to grab onto correlations and treat them as ironclad causal laws.
It's a well-known cognitive bias. We crave causal stories. When a sophisticated AI provides a plausible-sounding causal link, if you do X, then Y will happen because of Z, users often internalize that as definitive truth about how the world works, even if the AI only presented it as a probabilistic prediction based on its current model. They unjustifiably upgrade correlation to causation in their own minds.
Which leads to miscalibrated trust. People might follow the AI's advice even when it's wrong, or ignore crucial context the AI missed.
Precisely. So, managing and calibrating this trust is mandatory for safe deployment. The sources suggest two key mitigation strategies. First, the causation disclaimer.
Yeah.
Every CFE AI output, especially recommendations for action, must come with a clear, understandable disclaimer. It needs to explicitly state that the AI identifies patterns, correlations, and predicted causal pathways based on its model, but these are not guaranteed to be universal, infallible laws of reality. It tempers the user's natural jump to assuming definitive causality.
Okay, manage expectations. And the second strategy.
Mandatory human oversight. This loops back to the new rules. It must be an unbreakable rule that human professionals, the causal recourse engineers, the doctors using diagnostic support, the policymakers retain the final decision-making authority and ethical responsibility. They cannot just blindly delegate judgment to the CFE AI system, especially when the stakes are high or the recommended actions involve significant structural changes or ethical trade-offs.
The human remains firmly in the loop and accountable.
Absolutely non-negotiable, according to the ethical framework proposed.
Which brings us finally to governance. How do you govern a technology this powerful? It needs some kind of universal ethical framework.
Yes, the sources argue for a standardized framework built on core principles familiar from bioethics and AI ethics. Respect for autonomy, protecting individual choice and agency, non-maleficence, the duty to prevent harm, fairness, particularly addressing structural and systemic inequities, and explicability, transparency in how the system works and arrives at its conclusions, even if complex.
And that decentralized edge AI architecture we discussed earlier is actually part of upholding autonomy.
It's presented as a necessary technical constraint to achieve an ethical goal. By keeping sensitive data and processing localized, it inherently limits the potential for centralized control and manipulation, thereby structurally safeguarding personal agency to some degree.
Okay, last piece of the puzzle, and it's a fascinating one. CFE AI needs to model its own influence, the self-referential audit. It needs a policy on its own influence to combat that accumulative AI X risk.
Yes, this is the system needing to be aware of its own potential negative externalities.
What specific dangerous behavioral pattern does CFE AI predict its own success might create in humans?
It predicts a high risk of cognitive complacency. The concern is that as CFE AI becomes incredibly effective, ubiquitous, and reliable across many domains, health, finance, education, policy, humans will naturally start to delegate more and more critical thinking and complex decision-making to the system.
We'll get lazy because the AI is so good.
Essentially, yes. The resulting second or third order effect could be a widespread behavioral pattern of reduced critical thinking skills, diminished ability to handle ambiguity or novelty, and ultimately a decrease in overall societal resilience. We become brittle, overly dependent on the system. If the CFE AI network ever went down or faced a challenge completely outside its training, our ability to cope could be severely compromised.
So what's the counterfactual recommendations CFE AI makes to protect us from its own success, making us too vulnerable?
It's quite radical. CFE AI, modeling this risk, would recommend policy interventions deliberately designed to mandate a certain level of cognitive effort and inefficiency back into daily life.
Mandate inefficiency. That sounds counterintuitive.
It does, but the causal logic is about resilience. Specific recommendations might include mandating educational curricula heavily focused on critical thinking, resisting manipulation, and understanding causal reasoning itself, not just using the AI's outputs. And perhaps most strikingly, the creation of intentional AI-free zones in daily life and work.
AI-free zones, like times or places where you're explicitly not allowed to use AI assistance for certain tasks.
Exactly. Deliberate structural changes designed to force people to regularly exercise their own cognitive muscles, maintain their capacity for independent judgment, deep thought, and emotional resilience. It's about ensuring we don't delegate away the very skills that might be crucial for survival when the unexpected happens. It's a CFE AI intervention designed to preserve human agency against CFE AI's own potential downsides. #tag outro.
Wow. What a journey that was. We've really gone from the basics of explainable AI all the way to a system that aims to provide A structural, causal roadmap for coordinated purpose. That's the phrase used. Enabling humanity, potentially, to make truly evidence-based, adaptive choices about our collective future, our trajectory.
Yeah. The vision laid out is immense. CFE AI, as described, offers this potential technological capability to finally get a handle on the great filter, maybe overcome some of the instability inherent in that human paradox we discussed. It aims to model the actual structural conditions needed for human thriving, offer truly personalized recourse while preserving privacy via the edge, and allow leaders to rigorously test policies against how people are likely to really react. It's positioned as, well, a necessary tool for survival and maybe even optimized evolution if you take the sources at face value.
The power is undeniable, if it works as described. But, and this is a huge but, running through all the material, its usefulness, its safety, hinges completely on maintaining that rigorous ethical oversight, that mandatory human judgment, and constantly, consciously guarding against our own innate tendency to just accept the AI's correlations as universal absolute truth.
Which brings us right back to that critical tension highlighted throughout the sources, that existential timescale dilemma. The sheer speed, the acceleration we seem to need to develop CFE AI in time to solve our big problems. That speed itself might be contributing to the systemic erosion, the cognitive complacency, the very risks it's designed to prevent. And that leaves us, and leaves you, with a really important question to think about. In this race to build the potentially indispensable tool we might need for our own survival, how do we ensure that the sheer pace of our innovation doesn't itself become the fatal problem? How do we build in the pauses, the friction, the mandatory slowing down of thought and action that might be necessary to preserve genuine human critical capacity and wisdom along the way?
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
We'll see you soon.
This is DigitView.